Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. The Innocence Project is a thing of beauty because it involves people who actually believe there can be justice for those who are in prison for crimes they never committed. As a nonprofit legal clinic at the Benjamin Cardozo School of Law, it has helped to exonerate 240 people in the country who have collectively been incarcerated for 2,982 years over the past 17 years. Nina Morrison is a staff attorney at that project and my guest today. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You were also an executive director of the project.
I was
for
a brief period when we were transitioning.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about it. I know your specialty is litigation, which means that you are suing, right? States or localities for the DNA evidence they have to release it in order to help a defense.
Right. Well, we at the Innocence Project represent people who've been convicted of serious crimes, and we take over their cases usually at a time when they have no other legal hope for relief. So their trials are over, their appeals are finished, and their only hope of proving their claim of innocence is to get access to DNA evidence that through science can prove that they're actually innocent of the crimes for which they were convicted.
So how do you find them?
Well, they write to us. We started, as you mentioned, as a small legal clinic based at the Cardozo Law School back in 1992, and our co-founders, Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, had handled a couple of cases involving the earliest forms of DNA that were used to prove innocence, and got on TV in one of these high-profile cases and said, you know, if you think you have a claim that could be proven through DNA, write us a letter.
Oh.
And 15 years later, we have about 10,000 requests at any one time that we are considering from prisoners all around the country.
And how do you decide which one you're going to have?
We actually have a whole staff of people in our office who do nothing but review these cases and help us figure out which claims of innocence to take, and in particular, which are the ones that can involve new DNA evidence that could prove their innocence, because unfortunately, there are many, many more people in prison who are actually innocent than whose cases actually involve the kind of DNA that could be tested.
So you have to reject some of those people that you really think are innocent.
Right, so there are people who have absolutely very strong claims of innocence for whom we can do nothing. We do have colleagues at other organizations who help people who have non-DNA innocence claims, but in general, those are incredibly difficult cases because trying to overturn, they've gone through the whole system. And DNA is something that fortunately people see as a little bit different.
And so you pick the people that you think you can help, and then what happens? What's the next step?
Well, then we have a team of law students and lawyers through our Cardozo clinic who work to first try to figure out exactly how it is that DNA could prove someone's innocence. What are the different methods of testing we can use? What was the evidence used at their trial that we could test? And it's actually a pretty complicated inquiry. It's not just like, you know, here's a piece of evidence, let's test it, it'll tell us the answer either way. Right. And then we have to find the evidence, because that can often be the hardest part. And in New York in particular, you know, we handle cases from all around the country, but we have actually had, believe it or not, the hardest time in our hometown because the system is just not set up to find physical evidence 10 or 20 years after the fact.
Isn't that something? Have you ever had clients that that you really thought when you got into it that they were guilty?
Absolutely, and I've been wrong.
Yeah,
and I've had clients that I thought were innocent and I've been wrong, and that's the beauty of DNA, is that it takes out the guesswork. And that's what we try to tell judges when we go to court. You know, they say, well, this person was identified by 3 witnesses, or they confessed to the crime, and we say, listen, judge, you just don't know until you do the test. And you know, we have stories of all of the 240 people who've been exonerated through DNA, some through our work, some through others, on our website at innocenceproject.org. And if you read some of those stories, you think, well, there's no way in the world this person could have been convicted because they look so innocent. Or sometimes you think, boy, I never would have thought if you did a DNA test, this person actually would be innocent.
What actually do you mean when you say a DNA test?
Sure. DNA, you know, is a test for the unique genetic code that all of us have. And what we do is we take a piece of biological evidence. Say, for example, a woman is raped. If she goes to the hospital, a nurse or a physician will collect what's called a rape kit, which is some samples of fluid from her vagina or from her mouth, other areas, that might have DNA, usually sperm, blood, saliva, from the perpetrator of the crime.
Do they have the rape kits all over the country?
They do. It's very standard to take one.
Okay.
And actually, they collected those. One of the fortunate things about our work is those were collected even before anyone had heard of DNA testing, because they used to do a test just to see the blood type of the person. So there were some people who were wrongfully accused of rape, and then they would test and they'd say, oh, well, it looks as though the perpetrator has type A blood and this person has type AB blood, so they couldn't have been the perpetrator. But DNA is thousands of times more precise and specific to genetic codes than blood typing is, and that's
But it
why it's
doesn't
such a
mean that
unique
you only
test.
take cases where the victim has been raped.
No, we actually take murder cases. I had a case up in Cayuga County outside of Syracuse a couple years ago in which a woman had been killed and the perpetrator had bitten her all over her body through her clothes, and we were able to get saliva samples from the portions of the t-shirt where the bite marks were, and not only prove that it wasn't our client's saliva, but match that DNA to a man who had committed suicide a few years ago, who we had always suspected was the real perpetrator of the crime. He had actually thrown himself in front of a train just days after our client wrote him a letter from his jail cell saying, "I think you did this crime and you better confess to save your soul." Tragically, he killed himself without leaving a note confessing to the crime, but we were able to do the DNA, and our client was freed from prison.
Yeah, but it takes a long time.
It does. It does. And one of the barriers is that we can't find the evidence. In New York City, we actually had one client, Al Newton, who was in prison for an additional 10 years because the New York Police Department couldn't find the rape kit from the case for which he was convicted, even though when a diligent prosecutor finally went back and requested a new search and provided them with some new documentation, it was in the exact same place where it had been put 10 years earlier, and he lost 10 years of his life because the system was not in place to
So
find the
you're not
evidence.
only working to exonerate people and get them out of prison, you're also working to change the whole system.
That's right, because no one
You've
who
discovered
looks at
all
these
of these
cases,
things that go wrong.
It would be impossible to look at the cases, even one of the cases of our clients, and not say something has gone terribly wrong here. You know, it's like it's the equivalent of an airplane crash in the aviation system. In the criminal justice system, when someone is wrongfully convicted, it is literally a disaster, and we have to figure out what went wrong. The difference is that when a plane crashes, you have federal agencies that swoop in, the National Transportation Safety Board, do an objective analysis and say what went wrong and how can we prevent this from happening again. And that's what we're trying to do with the justice system.
So what are the different things? One is the access to DNA, which is your field.
Right.
So that means you go around, you go into the prison, you meet the person?
Right.
You really have personal contact.
We do. Sometimes we're on a very limited budget and our clients are scattered all around the country, so sometimes we can't meet them until many years into the case, but we do talk to them by phone, and in New York we usually meet our clients
And
early.
then you have to go to court.
We have to go to court.
Or you start with a prosecutor.
Right. Sometimes we actually don't go to court because I'd say in about half of our cases the prosecutors say, you know, my interest is in getting to the truth also. I want to do the DNA test. Just tell me what you want to do and let's work out the details. I wish it were more often, but it's
It's
still a good
amazing,
number
isn't
of
it, that there
times.
are prosecutors, public servants, who don't want to ever go back and redo something.
It is pretty amazing.
Right. Then you look, all right, so you do the DNA. You have to get it first, and then you do that. But then you look at ways people have been identified, right?
That's correct.
The lineups and how they get identified.
Exactly.
What happens there?
Well, one of the single leading causes of wrongful convictions that we found in our cases is eyewitness misidentification. Witnesses who are honest but mistaken. So they say, I am absolutely positive that is the man I saw wielding the gun running out of the convenience store. I would never forget his face because I've never seen a gun before. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my life. Or a woman who was raped who says, how could I forget that face? I have nightmares about it every night. And of course they're believable. Nobody thinks that they're not telling the truth or that they're not right. But in fact, traumatic events make you more likely to make a mistake because you're focused on your survival, not on making an accurate identification, even when you think you are.
So you can do that in a lineup of actual people that we see on television all the time. Or you can look at a book and go through it.
You can look at photographs, you know,
Or
there are
they
many
give you
ways,
photographs.
But there are two things that we know that are very important in changing how lineups are done that can really increase the rate that witnesses will make accurate identifications while decreasing the rate that they're going to make wrong identifications. So it's really a win-win for everybody. And the first thing they can do is they can actually have the officer who's administering the lineup not know who the suspect is. Because most officers, they don't have any interest in convicting an innocent person, but they know that number 3 is the guy that they think is the one who did it. They caught him with the property near the scene, or there was a tip that he was the one. He acted suspiciously when they questioned him. So they'll put him in number 3, and if she's looking and she says, I don't know, maybe it's number 2, unconsciously the officer might say, take your time, don't rush. Now that sends a signal, oh, maybe number 2 is not the right guy. But if they say it's number 3, they say, oh, okay, number 3, and they write, and sometimes they say things like, good job, you got him, that's our guy, reinforcing that that's the correct person. Now this is not a function of necessarily intending to frame an innocent person or even a guilty person. They're just reacting as a human being would. So one of the things that 30 years of research has shown can really reduce the rate of error is if the person who's administering the lineup just doesn't know who the right guy is, and that decreases the influence.
There's a woman that goes and speaks for you, isn't it, who was a rape victim and misidentified somebody?
There's a woman named Jennifer Thompson who has an amazing new book out, if folks are interested in the issue, called Picking Cotton, which is a play on the name of her co-defendant, Ronald Cotton, who, I'm sorry, co-defendant, the man that she mistakenly accused of rape, named Ronald Cotton, who's now incidentally a close friend of hers and the co-author of her book. And she was raped when she was a college student in North Carolina, was absolutely positive that was the man, studied every detail of his face during the rape. She said, I am going to nail this guy if I survive this. Obviously was an incredibly believable witness. It turned out years later they discovered through DNA that the man who committed the rape was not Ronald Cotton, but was another man named Bobby Poole, who Ronald Cotton's lawyers had brought to court for a hearing and said, isn't this the guy? And she said, I've never seen him before in my life. Since then, a lot has happened, but she's gone around from a victim's perspective saying, look, victims have an interest in getting it right also, because nobody's interests are served if the wrong person is in prison.
It's incredible. And then also, you pay attention to what goes on in the labs,
yes,
right? The
we do.
whole forensics of something.
We do, we do.
And that's a very big part of what goes, of how you get people out,
right? I mean, in over half of our cases, forensic science has been misused to convict an innocent person. Sometimes it's by using science that isn't validated science. Like, for example, I have one client in Florida who was convicted in part based on literally a dog sniff. There was a man who claimed that his specially trained dog could do scent lineups where he had the bed sheets from this rape and then my client's bed sheet from the jail and several other bed sheets. And he claimed that the dog alerted to my client's bed sheets. Now, the dog might have been alerting to the fact that my client had, petted a female dog the day before. I mean, who knows what that means? But it's not the same as a trained bomb-sniffing dog who can, detect hazards. This is really junk. There are also sciences that are good sciences, DNA being one of them, but in particular blood typing, certain kinds of hair analysis, fingerprint evidence in part, that either have been misused or have been used in court in a way that really isn't backed up by data. That is, they might say, well, there's a hair that has certain identifiable similarities to the defendant's hair that was found at the scene. That's fine. But have there been studies showing how common are the features in that hair? I mean, maybe the defendant has similar hair, and so does half the population. And so we have been leading the charge, along with a lot of other people, to have a rigorous review of the data that supports forensic science. You wouldn't have a medical procedure done if your doctor hadn't read published scientific articles and data proving that that procedure is going to do better than the 3 other procedures in getting you what you want, or take medication
approved by the FDA.
Exactly. And so one of the things that we think is important is to have an independent federal office or agency that is going to create and set and enforce rigorous standards for forensic science. Because God knows if any of us were on trial for your life, just the way if you were taking medication that could be a life or death matter, you would want to know that the evidence against you was real science.
Right. And so that's not up to the states. I mean, the federal government could really legislate that, or could create the institution, and they really could.
Right. Well, the states have a great deal of control over their criminal justice system, but if the Federal Institute creates standards, it's something we think that state judges would take seriously, because every state has laws that allow judges to screen what comes into the courtroom in the trial. And so right now, the judges who've been hearing fingerprint cases or ballistics cases or hair cases have said, well, this has been going on for 20 years. How can you say now that it's not reliable? But if an independent agency says, look, there are pieces of this discipline that are good and there are pieces that are bad, let's take a look at it, we think it'll help.
And they also commingle, don't they? I mean, there are all kinds of accidents that can happen in a forensic lab.
Right, and a lot of the labs, they do have very careful protocols, but it certainly
Unfortunately,
can be
we always
commingled.
hear the bad cases, and so that becomes what you think. I mean, I'm thinking now, we're going to really trust the judges, because I'm thinking of those guys in Pennsylvania who sent all those kids to detention, terrible things. But you found, I hope, mostly that judges really mean well?
I do. I mean, I think that most people in the criminal justice system really want the right result. The problem that we've seen is that, well, 2 things. One is that so many of our clients were convicted of very high-profile crimes. Particularly in the death penalty cases, there is a real need on the part of the community to figure out who did it. I had some clients in Long Island who were wrongfully convicted, 3 of them, of a rape murder of a 16-year-old girl walking home from a roller rink. Her body was found 3 weeks later, very badly decomposed. And, you know, as a parent myself, I mean, you can imagine how not only her family would feel, but every other family in the community in this quiet town would feel at risk until the guys are caught. And they had no leads for several months, and finally they got a 19-year-old former foster kid after 18 hours of questioning to come in and give a confession to the crime and implicate 2 other people.
That's another thing that hates, right.
And so even at the time of the trials, the evidence against these men was incredibly thin, I think the nature of the crime was so horrifying that people rushed to judgment. And so I think the jury didn't look at the evidence as closely as they might have. I think the prosecutors didn't screen their case as well as they might have. And I think the police and the judge cut corners. That's not the norm, but it does happen.
But that's also one of the things that you want to change, and that is changing, isn't it?
It is. And I should say that
it is a dilemma about why somebody would admit to a crime that they haven't committed.
Right, and it's hard to imagine. I mean, even though I've represented several people who have given false confessions to a crime they didn't commit, it is hard to imagine. But you know, there's a lot of research that shows. I mean, those of us who've never been on the other side of a police interrogation don't know just how scary it can be and how quickly your will can be broken down. Fatigue plays a role in it. If it's 2 in the morning and you are just exhausted, some people, especially young people, will think, I am just so tired. They're not going to let me go till I do what they want. I'll just sign this piece of paper, and I know I'm innocent, so I'll work it out later. My mom will hire a lawyer. They'll find out the truth. It'll all go away. What's the harm if I sign this piece of paper now? And little do they know, they could be signing themselves away to a life prison term.
Right. It's so terrible. So now what your position is, and how often, and in how many states do they do that? They record, what do? They record the questioning or the confession? Well,
here's the interesting part. If you record only the confession, you're missing a whole lot of very valuable information. Right. So in some ways, it is worse to have a tape just of the confession, because all you see is this guy saying very calmly, yes, I did it, or signing the paper and saying I'm willingly signing it, and you don't see what led up to it. There's an interesting article that was written by a police officer in D.C. named Jim Trainum, who's a wonderful ally of ours, who, in a case that the suspect was exonerated through non-DNA evidence. It was a woman, and she actually had an airtight alibi that they found out later where she couldn't have committed the crime. She was on video somewhere else at the time. She gave a confession of the crime. He didn't abuse her, yell at her, anything. But because they had taped the whole interrogation, he was able to go back and see how they had fed her all of the pieces of information that ended up in the confession. And through this very complicated, almost a back and forth dance, she had taken in everything they told them. So when she was ready to say, you know what, I'm just going to be done with this and tell them what they want to hear, she knew all this information that they thought only the suspect could know. And until you record the entirety of the information, you can't tell.
So is that up to the states?
It is up to the states. I mean, the federal government can prescribe guidelines, but for state prisoners.
Most of the states do that now?
No, actually, most don't. And they're starting to. The interesting thing is that most places, and again, it's county by county, city by city usually, that try it. The police officers love it because one of the things that it does is it protects them against false claims of coercion or abuse. They have a record that they didn't hit the guy, they didn't yell at the guy told them where the body was, and they didn't give him the information, and he led them to it. He told them where the evidence was. He gave them a detail about what the victim was wearing that nobody could have known if they weren't there. That's the kind of thing that can corroborate a good police officer's account. So by and large, they like it, and the bad confessions get thrown out.
And then another part of what you do is compensation for all the time and hours that they've spent in prison.
Yeah,
that's all up to local.
We at the Innocence Project don't represent people in their compensation cases, so we get them out the door, and then there are other lawyers or agencies who handle their compensation cases. But on our website, we actually have a map where you can click on and look state by state as to how many states have compensation. It's amazing to believe, though, that in about, I think, a third of the states right now, you can get out of prison unquestionably innocent, 10, 20 years in prison and get not a dime, you know, a bus ticket, and sorry about that.
Like the $40.
Yeah, and in some states you get limited to, say, $10,000 for the 20 years you did, maybe, or some will maybe be $10,000 a year. Now, I don't know about you, but you couldn't pay me $10,000 to spend a week in prison. It's such an awful place,
absolutely,
you know. So
an hour.
Yeah.
But it's so, I mean, here are people whose lives we've interrupted and really harmed to such an incredible degree. And then we release them, what do? So the ones who are working with you are really very lucky, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, we have a social work staff. We a couple of years ago, we raised the funds to hire 2 social workers because, personally, I as a lawyer couldn't begin to help
Take all the
figure out.
problems.
Yeah, and even just knowing what to do, because
Yeah.
their needs, in many ways, they're like veterans. They've come
Yeah.
back from an incredibly traumatic experience. People welcome them home with open arms as heroes, but then the parades go away,
Yeah.
it gets quiet, and they have to struggle with all that they've lost. Their kids have grown up,
That's
their
horrible.
families have disintegrated, sometimes their families died.
Yeah,
You know,
it's just horrible.
It's horrible. But that said, you know, so many of our exonerees are leading the fight for reform, are,
great.
you know, positive members of the community, have started new families. It's really, it's a real testament to the resiliency.
So what percentage of your clients are people of color?
I don't know the number to that. We, when we had our 200th exoneration a few years ago, we analyzed a lot of the data and found a very disproportionate number of our clients were convicted in cross-racial crimes. That is, they were a person of color who was misidentified by one or more witnesses who were white, sometimes of other races. And that's often because we are actually worse at telling the differences among subtle distinctions and features between people of other races than we are of our own, just simply because of the lack of familiarity in many cases. And also, cross-racial crimes tend to get prosecuted at a higher rate than interracial crimes. So it's certainly become a big problem, and you know,
Are they
it is
as much if
disproportionate.
you're a white man who's raped a black woman?
Certainly the errors are possible, but no, those are not.
Yeah,
It's
right.
you know,
It's
the standard
really a question of color.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole criminal justice system is really one, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's very
there are
sad.
certainly a lot of issues, and there are organizations that we are working with that are trying to figure out what exactly is the intersection between wrongful conviction and race. To some extent, it's the outrage of the community factor I talked to before, where when there was a white victim, you know, as has been shown in the death penalty context, those cases are subject often to swifter and harsher prosecution than against victims of color.
Do you have any opinion, which is so interesting, on what we do with pedophiles and people who have been convicted and also released of sexual?
You know, that's an area that we don't take on. I mean, I will say that the first thing, the most important thing to do is figure out who the right people are. And certainly if there is a case where someone has been convicted of raping or otherwise sexually assaulting a child, and there's DNA evidence that could be tested, I would hate to see anyone's horror at the crime keep them from wanting to do a DNA test. If anything, that should make you want to be more certain, because if the wrong person is in prison, the right person may be out harming more children. So, you know, certainly, and child witnesses are more unreliable, obviously not in necessarily reporting what happened to them, but they are more prone to suggestion and can be led to make misidentifications
I just
than
meant
others.
you personally as a lawyer. I mean, unfortunately, we've had some sensational cases lately with people who've been in prison and now are out and are on that list. But it seems to me also it's a great opportunity for just limiting rights of people.
I mean, I do, you know, my personal view is that there are the sex offender registration laws, even if you accept that they serve a very valid purpose for a small group of recidivist pedophiles who commit serious crimes against children and who you'd want to know about. Those have been expanded so vastly to include any sex crime. And by sex crime, I don't just mean any crime against adults. I'm talking about statutory rape, you know, where a 19-year-old boy has
it's
voluntary
really
sex with his 16-year-old high school girlfriend when he's just turned 18 or 19, and he is now on the internet for life as a sex offender. I mean, that's not the purpose that those laws were intended to serve.
Now, how did you get into all of this? That's what I want to know.
Well, I was lucky enough to go to NYU Law School, where I had a scholarship for people who wanted to do public service careers. So I never had to worry about debt for my law school education, because when I started, we were guaranteed not only my scholarship funds, but that any loans we took out would be forgiven by the school if you did public service work. So I and a number of my classmates had the freedom to choose, did we want to go have frankly less satisfying from my perspective jobs in large law firms working for corporate clients, or did we want to do something that was a little more meaningful, even if less lucrative? And that was where the path started.
Even to get to the point where you wanted to do that public service. How did you grow up? I mean, where did the desire? It's so interesting to me, because some people just have that from the very beginning in their lives.
I would like to take credit for being sort of my own self-made woman, but my apple did not fall very far from my tree. My father was a public interest lawyer as well, and I actually resisted going to law school for a little while, thinking I would make my own way. But he worked for a group that was founded by Ralph Nader called Public Citizen for many years, and even though he didn't do criminal law and we had somewhat different interests, he really brought home the value that you spend so much of your life working, you might as well like what you do. You know, feel like you've done some good for other people, but most mostly enjoy it. And then when I finished college, I went to California, and I got a job not as a lawyer, but working as an investigator for a group that represented death row inmates. And I spent 3 years almost working on behalf of people, many of whom were guilty of the crimes for which they were convicted, mostly working to try to get their sentences commuted from death to life. And that was my first real exposure to the criminal justice system.
That's a terrible emotional tug, isn't it?
It was, and I was pretty young to absorb it all. And I actually had one of my clients who I was very, very close to, was actually executed during my first year of law school, and I talked to him on the phone the night that he was executed. It was very rough. So I didn't think I would ever do any death penalty cases again after that, but I've worked back in a little bit.
It's an incredible kind of thing. I mean, I just think the whole concept of death penalty is so unbelievable, no?
Yeah, it is, and I wasn't sure at the time. I mean, I had, worked for many clients who were guilty. Some of them were not guilty of everything they were convicted of. Some were much less culpable than other co-defendants. I had clients who were mentally disabled, who clearly took the fall for the ringleaders of the group, who got off with lesser sentences. But what I saw was that, the real measure of our society is how we treat people accused of serious crimes. It really is the test of who we are as a people and what kind of basic rights and protections do we afford them. And so many times people had lawyers who were drunk, who didn't do their homework, prosecutors who cheated and lied and fabricated evidence. I mean, not in all cases by any means, but in enough to really give you pause about how fair the system was. And from there, the innocence work was sort of a natural outgrowth, because what we do now is we shine a light on the problems in a way that everyone can agree with, because no matter how you feel about the death penalty, I have met some of the most pro-death penalty people, older relatives of mine, friends, acquaintances, colleagues, who say, I'm for the death penalty, but the last thing I would want is for an innocent person to be executed.
Well, we've come to the end of our half hour. Thank you very much, and I'm glad that we have people like you in this world, because certainly there are many people who depend on you to bring some justice to their lives.
Well, thank you, Ronnie. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Nina. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.